It doesn't take much real insight to recognize that things have changed around here. The America of 2025 is vastly different from the America of 30 or 40 years ago. And I often hear Christians use a verse out of Psalm 11 to sort of throw up their hands in despair. Psalm 11, verse 3 says, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Let's talk about what the righteous can do. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? That verse is wielded in our generation by believers who sort of use it as a shrug of the shoulders and says, the world is what it is. I mean, what can be done? How can we change things? Well, let me take this episode of Truth Currents to encourage you. There's a lot of times that we look at really hard topics and they're weighty and they drive us to our knees in prayer. But I want to think through some things that are happening right now that should give you encouragement. Now, I know if you're reading the news today, you've seen a number of Democratic politicians who have been dogging on prayer. They've mocked prayer as a response to crisis moments like school shootings. I don't know who's in charge of the message, but they're getting the same message because they're all using the same language. And I'd like to talk to the person who's creating the message and say, making fun of the faith system, the belief system, the worldview of a majority of American citizens is probably not a recipe for any kind of political comeback for your party. They continue to dig themselves into a hole, but we'll let that happen. Let's look at what's actually taking place in our culture. First of all, in a technical sense, if you understand the language, pride seems to be on the decline. There's no question that in June of this year, the Pride Month, as we've been propagandized to call it, we saw less and less corporate involvement in so-called pride events. Corporations are finally getting the message that it is not financially profitable to push an ideological agenda that contradicts the belief system of the vast majority of Americans. Now we find out it's not only happening in the corporate world, but it's happening in the media world as well. GLAAD, which is an organization that promotes all things LGBTQ, has recently published their analysis of television and movies, where they track the number of openly homosexual characters that are in all of our media. Have you ever been watching a movie or a TV show and two men that are playing roles and they have there's been no hint whatsoever, and then boom, out of the blue, they lean over and kiss each other and you're like, why was that necessary? How does that further the story? Well, often it doesn't further the story, but it's a nod to the pressure that people in Hollywood get to try and normalize homosexual behavior. Well, as GLAAD has done their most recent survey, what they've determined is that openly homosexual characters on broadcast TV has clocked a decrease of 31%, and on cable TV, a decrease of 45%. In other words, they say that the presence of openly homosexual characters in movies and television is now at the lowest figure in a decade. Even Saturday Night Live has started to poke fun at holes in the gay propaganda agenda. Well, Gallup is tracking that politically, support for same-sex marriage is tanking. We were told a decade ago with Obergefell, the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex, same-gender marriage across the country. In that 10 years, one of the things we've discovered is that homosexual marriage, we were told it wasn't about us, it didn't connect to us, it was just a small group, we just want to let people love who they want to love and just be fine. And we were screaming, no, there's a slippery slope here, there's an agenda. Well, guess what? 10 years later, everybody sees it. We were right. There was always an agenda. Same-gender marriage was never the end game. It was an open door to so much else. They pushed the boundaries when they decided that we had to accept not just same-gender marriage, but that we had to accept the whole transgender ideology. We had to believe that children should be given drugs and mutilating surgeries and that that's okay. That's called healthcare. Now, they've pressed it to the point where we're supposed to think that bestiality is normal. In fact, pedophilia, the love of children, is normal. You see, it was all in the seeds of the original agenda. But now, as it has become more explicit, guess what? Americans are pushing back. They're not interested. And frankly, the more we are lectured by the left, the less impact it has. You might call it moral fatigue because, frankly, whether it's politicians or celebrities or activists, the average American is just tired of being told that they're a horrible person because they don't believe every bizarre thing that most of humanity has never believed in the history of the world. Well, I take great comfort in the fact that the pushback has begun, that the decline of acceptability of some of these kinds of things are happening. In fact, there is now talk in legal circles that with a case that is proceeding through the legal system out of Kentucky, that will probably land in the lap of the Supreme Court sometime next year, there is a legitimate shot at Obergefell being overturned. And in the same way that Roe v. Wade disappeared into legal history as a footnote, Obergefell and the legalization of same-gender marriage may be on its way out the door. It barely survived a decade until people said this is not what we were told. Now, part of that package is research is finally making it to the surface. We were told so many things about what the experts had to say, and it normalized all these kinds of behaviors because the argument was there's no downside, there's no damage done by any of these things. And yet now, finally, we are seeing legitimate, peer-reviewed, double-blind studies that pass all of the expectations of what quality research looks like. And those research projects are now telling us things like, guess what? It does matter if a child has a mother and a father, as opposed to two mothers or two fathers. We were told for years that there's no difference. A family is a family, except now research tells us that that's not true. There is something biologically wired into the makeup of men and into the makeup of women that makes the combination of a mother and a father living together in a home the ideal structure for the raising of well-balanced mentally, emotionally, and physically the children that come out of those homes. Finally, what we all knew intuitively, what our gut told us, has been proven by actual scientific research. Well, it's not just the sexual revolution that's under assault by pushback. Statistics tell us that 62% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 hold a favorable view of socialism, with 1/3 of those numbers favoring full-blown communism. It's interesting that socialism and communism are always supported by people who have never experienced either one. But even that is receiving pushback. There's a new book out called The Anti-Greed Gospel by Malcolm Foley. Embarrassingly, Malcolm Foley is an administrator at Baylor University, a school that used to be Baptist, but now is pretty much nothing at all. And his argument is that capitalism is, in fact, the cause of the suffering in the world, and that Jesus promotes socialism. I've seen this argument for years. It doesn't hold water. The New Testament does not teach socialism. Jesus did not weigh in heavily on economic theory. But the fact of the matter is, capitalism has been, where it's been tried, it has been the engine out of which millions of global citizens have risen out of poverty. In fact, nations like China and Nigeria and Russia even, as they have moved away from a centrally controlled communist economic structure and allowed capitalism to take root, they have seen standards of living increase dramatically. And that happens everywhere it's tried. And yet, the liberal progressive left in this country is still enamored with this idea that a small group of people refusing to recognize the flaws in human nature, but a small group of well-meaning people can make decisions that will just be to the benefit of everybody. No, our founding fathers understood that human nature requires restraint. It requires a limitation of power. That's why our political structure is one of the greatest models of building a nation in the history of mankind. But what I see happening is, for the first time, we are not allowing the assumption that socialism is a better system. There is actually pushback. You say, well, if Jesus didn't talk about economic theories, then why are we concerned about it? We're concerned about it because our choice of economic system should reflect our understanding, our biblical worldview of what is required to be in the best interest of fallen human nature. A system that creates opportunity but limits despotism. As we're watching right before our eyes, here's what I want to encourage you about. Whether it's the sexual revolution, whether it's in media, politics, within activism circles, even as we see the question of adoption by same-sex parents, now economic theories, in every direction that you're looking, we are seeing a resurgence of a biblical worldview. Now, that's not to say that everybody in America has all of a sudden become a Christian, but it is to say that the underlying worldview that made America what it is, what it once was, is making a comeback. 5 years ago, a Pew Research report told us that 18 to 25-year-olds were peaking as the highest generation in history of claiming no religious affiliation at all. They were called the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, that is, no affiliation, none whatsoever. And they were the largest single group in the United States, outnumbering both Catholics and Protestants. Well, that was then. This is now. And now we see, even in the younger generations, a resurgence of serious interest in Christianity. Even a source like the New York Times has noted that there is an increasing number of young men going back to church. There are positive signs everywhere of what is happening. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that Bible sales are booming, fueled by what they call first-time buyers. In other words, people are actually going to the store to buy a Bible when they've never had one before. All of those are good things. You see, the question here is, do we buy into the last gasp of progressive media who are trying to continually play their same old story of assaulting us with how bad we are, with propagandizing the nation with how we're on the wrong side of history and that they're the vanguard of advancement and sophistication? Or do we actually pay attention to what's happening around us and see the bell ringing for the funeral of progressivism? Let me take you back to Psalm 11. Remember that verse? If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? See, if we pull that verse out and just read it by itself, it sounds like the psalmist is shrugging his shoulders. He's throwing up his hands and he's saying, what are you going to do? But you got to read the next verse. He says, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And then he answers his own question. In verse 4, he says, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven, and his eyes see. Folks, here's what I want you to hold on to today. I want this to be an encouragement to you, because we've had too many believers who just went into their hidey hole. They just locked their doors and pulled down their shades, and they shrugged their shoulders and said, if the foundations are destroyed, What can you do? I'll tell you exactly what you can do. You can remember that the Lord is still on his throne and his eyes see everything. Folks, not only do we win in eternity, but I want you to be encouraged because we are beginning to see a resurgence. We are starting again to win in the culture wars. Drop to your knees, not in despair, but in intentional intercession, pleading with God to continue to do what he's doing, to bring revival to our nation, to bring spiritual awakening to our churches, so that the inklings of return to a biblical foundation, a Christian worldview, that return would accelerate and that we would bury some of the worst ideas in human history. We would bury them in the cemetery of bad ideas, and we would get back to acknowledging that there is a God and we answer to him. And America can be something so much more than it is right now. God, please have your way with the church and the nation in this generation. This is Truth Currents.